Set in a rural village, the tale focuses on Pedro and Jimmy, two brothers living on a farm. They have just heard gunshots coming from the forest behind their house. Although gunshots are common in this area, usually hunters shooting at pests like wild boar and other animals, what catches Pedro's attention is that the shots were fired almost 5 times and sounded different from a typical hunting rifle. This arouses Pedro's curiosity about what might be happening in the forest. When they investigate the source of the noise, they find a body of a man with the upper half completely missing, leaving only the waist and legs. Alongside the body, they find a box containing antique items and a book with the name and address of Maria, a neighbor in their village. When Pedro and Jimmy visit Maria, they learn that the man found in the forest was indeed on his way to Maria's house to check on her eldest son, Uril, who is seriously ill. Pedro is shocked to see Uril, whose condition is dire. Almost 80% of his body is decaying and emitting a foul odor. The village is in a state of panic due to rumors of a demonic plague or supernatural illness. Those infected with this plague suffer from various horrific effects, one of which is the decay, similar to what Uril is experiencing. Maria reveals that Uril has been suffering from this illness for almost a year. The deceased man they found in the forest might have been a medical expert, healer, or perhaps a paranormal specialist who intended to treat Uril's rare and horrifying disease. Pedro and Jimmy immediately went to the nearest police station to report the condition of Uril. Pedro complained about the authorities neglecting their citizens' suffering for a long time instead of addressing the issue promptly. These esteemed officials claimed they had much more important, urgent, and critical matters to attend to than just the suffering of a citizen, which clearly indicated that Western authorities seemed less concerned about their people compared to officials in our country. Since they did not receive a positive response from the authorities, Pedro and Jimmy went to see Mr. Ruiz, the largest landowner, with the most coconut trees, rice fields, and livestock in the village. Mr. Ruiz was a superstitious person, so hearing about Uril's condition, which had been rotting for a year, made him panic. He angrily asked Pedro why he had only mentioned it now, fearing that a demonic plague might destroy all his livestock and wealth. Leaving his pregnant wife behind, Mr. Ruiz went to Maria's house with the intention of shooting Uril with his hunting rifle. Maria and her youngest son continued to plead with him not to kill her eldest son, not out of pity or concern, but because Maria had long wished to end the suffering by killing him. However, according to rumors, killing someone who is possessed by demons could cause even greater harm. Thus, Maria deliberately allowed her eldest son to remain in this state for the greater good. Understanding Maria's reasoning, the master decided to cancel his intention and chose to wait outside until the next morning. When Pedro and Jimmy arrived, the master asked them to help carry the body of S.I. Uril as far away as possible, hoping to prevent the demonic plague from affecting their land and village. After traveling nearly 50 kilometers, the master and Pedro had a brief argument about whether their clothes, which might be contaminated, should be burned. Pedro's refusal almost led the master to run over a child on the road. They finally reached a location 100 kilometers from their village, but instead of disposing of Uril's body in a small ditch, the master realized that the body was no longer on the vehicle. They assumed that the body must have fallen off when the master swerved to avoid hitting the child. Since they were too far from their village, they decided to return home, hoping everything would be fine. Back at home, Pedro and Jimmy were still anxious, wondering if what they had done earlier was enough, whether the village would be safe and if everything was truly over. The master, who had lost his appetite, was startled by a scream from his pregnant wife. Upon investigation, they found that one of their goats was behaving strangely, staring intently at his wife. Believing the goat to be possessed, the master, in his anger, aimed his weapon at it. However, his wife shared Maria's belief that killing possessed beings would only release the demon. Despite this, the master, in his fury, shot the goat, leading to an unexpected outcome. Pedro and Jimmy returned home just as they saw the shadow of a deer head moving by itself. They heard the voice of a young boy from outside who turned out to be Ujang, Maria's youngest son and Ulil's younger brother. Ujang confessed that his mother had been missing since earlier that afternoon and that the master was reported dead along with his wife. Ujang was afraid to stay alone in his house, so he came to ask Pedro and Jimmy for permission to stay with them until his mother returned. He asked to sleep in the barn near the cowshed. Although Jimmy was not fully in agreement with his brother's decision, they felt it would be cruel to let a child go home alone on such a dark night. The next day, Pedro and Jimmy went to town to seek help and warn Pedro's ex-wife to leave the town as soon as possible. Coincidentally, her new husband, Leo, was also there. Leo seemed cooperative and allowed Pedro to enter the house, instructing him to remove all his clothes to be burned. Pedro continued to explain about the demonic plague spreading in their district. Pedro's strange behavior naturally left his ex-wife, Sabrina, and Leo confused. While they were all busy arguing, Sabrina's pet dog was seen licking Pedro's clothes, which were clearly contaminated. No one knew what effect this would have on the dog, but Pedro quickly burned all the clothes. Afterward, they gave him some replacement clothes. During his marriage to Sabrina, Pedro had 2 sons, Santino, who was still young, and Fahar, who unfortunately had a disability or mental condition. With her new husband, Leo, Sabrina had been blessed with 1 young daughter. While the 3 parents were busy arguing and the little girl was watching nearby, something horrifying suddenly happened. The dog dragged the little girl out of the house. Pedro, who had returned home first, was shocked to see Sabrina realize that something had gone terribly wrong. He quickly took his 2 sons, Fahar and Santino, to the car and drove away from the place as fast as he could. Whether intentionally or not, Leo hit Sabrina and their young daughter with the car, which only strengthened Pedro's suspicion about the influence of the demon. Pedro immediately sped away from the neighborhood. His suspicions about the recent events were correct. It seemed the little girl was no longer human, as evidenced by her jumping and dancing around while her parents lay dying, trapped under the vehicle. Back with Pedro, he picked up Jimmy and their mother, whom we'll call Grandma, to take them far away from the village. During the journey, Grandma told her grandson Santino a story about demons, mentioning 7 important rules to follow when someone is possessed. Don't turn on the electric lights. Keep animals away. Don't take anything close to the possessed person. Don't harm the possessed person. Don't shoot them with a weapon. Don't ask for lottery numbers. Don't ask about the results of the upcoming presidential election. And don't say the demon's name. And don't cheat even if the person is possessed. Fajar, the eldest son, who has difficulty communicating, suddenly growled, asking for his favorite apple ice cream, forcing Pedro to stop the car to buy it for him. At that moment, a phone call came from Grandma's phone, and surprisingly, it was from Sabrina. How could this be possible, considering Sabrina had clearly died earlier? Sabrina spoke loudly as if nothing had happened, which made Pedro suspicious that it was no longer Sabrina. He chose not to say a word, even though Sabrina kept shouting, demanding her two sons back. Eventually, they arrived at the house of a woman named Mirta, a close friend of Jimmy's. Mirta was known to have extensive experience with the supernatural, including demons. This allowed Jimmy to freely explain the problems their village and district were facing, hoping Mirta would understand and allow their family to stay at her place for a while. As night fell, Pedro, Jimmy, and Fahar slept in the car while Grandma stayed awake. Once everyone was asleep, Sabrina appeared, intending to take her son, Santino. Grandma saw her and immediately called Pedro to check. Sabrina jumped over the fence, prompting Pedro to rush out and chase her. Mirta quickly intervened, advising them to listen to her explanation before taking any action. Mirta, who had experience with the supernatural, owned a special device identical to one found with a corpse in the forest. This device was designed to trap demons. She explained that they could use the device to end the nightmare, but it would only work on the first person who had been possessed, Uril Sitambun. They had to find Uril, who had fallen on the road earlier. Grandma stayed behind to watch over Fajar, hoping to keep the remaining family members safe. After driving for a few minutes, Jimmy saw Sabrina walking while carrying Santino. Shockingly, she was eating the contents of Santino's head. Realizing Sabrina could not be saved, Jimmy decided to end her life by running her over. He forgot that killing a possessed person would release the demon trapped inside. Grandma was surprised when Fahar, who was previously known to have communication challenges, suddenly began walking and speaking fluently, even asking Grandma to make him a cup of tea. Mirta then shared more about her past, which might explain why Pedro's village was facing a dark presence. Long ago, Mirta and her husband had a church where they engaged in deceptive practices under the guise of healing and exorcism. They encountered a real challenge when a congregant, who was genuinely troubled by a dark force, began behaving erratically, revealing that he had been under a severe and disturbing influence. After that incident, Mirta and her husband started learning about genuine spiritual healing. For 12 years, Mirta worked in this field until she retired shortly after her husband passed away from an illness. Instead of retiring, Mirta decided to buy a house in Pedro's village about a year ago, hoping to find peace and enjoy her old age. Her move coincided with the time when Uril first showed signs of a troubling condition. It seemed likely that Mirta's past indirectly played a role in the dark presence in the village. Since what had happened was irreversible, Pedro didn't blame Mirta directly but asked her to help make the village safe again by finding a way to address the situation. They stopped at an elementary school building where Mirta instructed Pedro to turn off the car lights, including the flashlights they carried, as these could attract unwanted attention. Pedro was startled to see several children sitting quietly in a classroom, despite it being late at night with no classes. Mirta explained that younger individuals were more susceptible to influence from darker forces because they were easier to sway. Some people were naturally resistant to such influences, like Pedro, Jimmy, and herself. However, darker forces were persistent, and if they couldn't influence one person, they would try to mislead others. Since the children couldn't communicate clearly, Pedro and Mirta decided to go to the school hall, following Mirta's instincts. Indeed, under the wooden floorboards they found a troubling scene involving the school staff. Most importantly, they found Uril in a distressed state. As Pedro worked to help Uril, the presence inside Uril began to speak, trying to provoke Pedro. Mirta warned Pedro not to act impulsively, but when Pedro felt threatened, he became agitated. Unfortunately, this led to further chaos, and in the confusion, Mirta was harmed, and their plan to help Uril was interrupted. In the aftermath, Pedro realized that a serious misunderstanding had taken place, leading to tragic results. Feeling disheartened, he decided to return home. Now only Jimmy and Fahar remained of his family. While Pedro was taking a bath, Jimmy remembered Ujang and eventually admitted to having done something wrong. After finishing his bath, Pedro gave Fahar his favorite apple ice cream. Suddenly, Fahar began to choke, and Pedro realized that something was seriously wrong. In the end, only Pedro and Jimmy were left. What they would do next was uncertain, but they knew they had to find a way to restore peace and safety. They were aware that they needed to be vigilant and cautious in the face of any future challenges.